The air is thick with rot, a haze of invisible spores drifting through the manufactorum corridors like a silent sermon. Every step echoes against rusted steel, and the sound is swallowed too quickly, as if the walls themselves hunger for it. There are whispers here, not of men, but of something older and infinitely patient, something that coils itself into the marrow of the weak and waits for the moment of surrender. To face Nurgle's corruption is not to meet a sudden blade or a bolt of plasma. It is to be dissolved slowly, the boundaries between flesh and filth collapsing until you cannot remember where one ends and the other begins. Death would be a mercy, but Nurgle does not grant mercy. He offers only eternity in the embrace of decay. If you are drawn into this descent, if you want to hear more of how rot reshapes flesh, of how souls are tested against an enemy who wins not by swiftness, but by inevitability, then join this journey. Like, share, and subscribe so that you do not walk these halls alone. The first signs never announced themselves as plague. That was the cruelty of it. In the cavernous sprawl of the manufactorum, where engines shrieked and furnaces belched promethium haze into the lungs of thousands, sickness was no stranger. A cough was dismissed as dust. A fever was excused as exhaustion. No man or woman working those lines expected to die from the air they breathed. They already knew they would die in service, ground down by labor and devotion to terror's dream. Yet something invisible had crept in. It clung to the corners where light dared not reach, where the shadows gathered thick and damp. The spores drifted unseen, inhaled with every weary breath, settling like seeds in the folds of flesh. A riveter named Karos was among the first. His hands were steady, his back iron-strong from 2 decades of toil. But he found his skin itching, his nails discolored, his joints thick with pain that no medicae salve would soothe. He told himself it was nothing. Everyone told themselves it was nothing, but the itch never faded. It deepened. By the time Karos's cough became a wet rattle, dozens more had joined him. The overseers barked for faster work, their voices magnified through vox grills crusted with grease and dust. They spoke of quotas, of duty to the Imperium, of the endless war beyond these walls. Yet in the quiet spaces between orders, men and women bent double, their stomachs twisting, their eyes ringed with black. Some vomited blood, and when it splattered onto the steel flooring, the droplets did not dry. They clung, slick and shining, as if the metal itself hungered for their sickness. The Astro Militarum garrisoned nearby dismissed the rumors at first. Soldiers had seen worse. Whole regiments had marched into pestilence and survived by the Emperor's will. But these were not battlefront plagues with names, banners, and known cures. This was subtler, crueler. Guardsmen on patrol began to feel the same heat in their lungs. They scratched their arms until welts bled beneath the carapace of their armor. They swore they saw things at the edges of sight, tiny motes pulsing green in the air, vanishing when stared at directly. No alarms rang, no klaxons screamed. There was only the steady groan of machines, the hammering of pistons, the endless churn of industry, until one morning the machines fell silent. Not all of them, not yet. Just one line, then another. Servitors locked into their posts froze mid-task, their eyes flickering with static. Flesh degraded faster than steel, and those half-men, half-machine constructs were not immune. A servitor's arm tore free at the shoulder, dropping a sheet of molten ore across the grating. It should have seared the air with the clean sting of burning metal. Instead, the smell was wrong, sweet, cloying, a stench that made even hardened soldiers retch into their rebreathers. When the engineers investigated, they found the corruption already spreading through sacred conduits. Unfamiliar molds clung to cables. Rust blossomed in hours where it should have taken years. They whispered prayers to the Omniscience, but their hymns did not banish the growth. Instead, some swore they heard laughter, soft, bubbling, carried through the vox lines as if the manufactorum itself had become a throat for something that should not speak.
Karos was found 3 days later, though found was too kind a word. His fellows uncovered him in a side chamber, collapsed against a wall scrolled with half-finished litanies. His body was not his own anymore. The skin was translucent, stretched taut over something swollen beneath, and when one worker dared touch him, the surface split. A torrent of filth gushed forth, not blood, but a slurry of bile and worms and yellow-green pus that hissed where it touched the floor. They fled in horror, but not before the filth had splattered their boots, their trousers, their exposed skin. By the next day, those men too began to cough. In the silence that followed, faith became the last refuge. Workers clutched imperial aquila pendants to their chests, whispering prayers to the emperor for strength, but even faith bent beneath the weight of dread. One woman insisted her pendant had begun to corrode in her palm, the twin-headed eagle reduced to a formless smear. Another swore she had dreamed of a garden sprouting in the manufactorum's ruins, vines wrapping around the steel, blossoms opening with faces that wept and laughed in the same breath. She told no one for days, but the dream returned each night until her resolve cracked. When she confessed, half the workers spat and cursed her as a heretic, the other half only nodded, hollow-eyed, admitting they had seen the same. Every breath became a gamble. Every cough became a prayer not to collapse. And still the overseers demanded work. The quotas did not shrink, for war never sleeps, and the Imperium has no patience for weakness. But the air carried more than orders. It carried inevitability. The first spores had taken root, and no fire, no steel, no decree could burn them away. The manufactorum had become a tomb in waiting. The manufactorum had always been a place where exhaustion was currency. Men collapsed at their stations, dragged away by comrades only to return when breath found them again. But what now spread through its veins was different. It did not empty a man of strength in one single blow. It hollowed him piece by piece, leaving the shell to keep working until even the shell surrendered. A guardsman named Lauren was the first in uniform to show the full sickness. His squad had been posted at the main gate, a squad of ordinary Astra Militarum infantry assigned to keep order among the laborers and to remind them that every bolt hammered here fed the Imperium's endless hunger for war. Lauren had been strong, a veteran of 2 campaigns, proud to polish the aquila etched into his flak armor. But one evening, as the sun bled its last light through the choking haze, he collapsed mid-patrol. His squad mates laughed at first, mocking his clumsiness, until they heard the sound. It was not the sound of a man coughing blood, nor of a chest struggling to draw breath. It was wet, bubbling, almost gleeful, as though something inside him delighted in its freedom. They pulled off his helmet, hoping to clear his airway, and recoiled at once. His lips had split into cracks oozing green filth, and from within his throat tiny pale grubs writhed against his tongue, spilling in a stream across the floor. He tried to speak, to beg, to scream, but all that came forth was a gurgle. His eyes rolled back, and when his comrades tried to carry him, his flesh tore beneath their hands like rotten cloth. By dawn, word of his death had spread among the regiments stationed nearby. Commanders barked denials, insisting it was nothing more than fever and exhaustion, that no contagion had broken through the walls. But soldiers are not fools. They know when death wears a different mask. Already whispers ran through the barracks. Nurgle. Some spat the name with contempt, others with terror, but all of them spoke it too often for their officers' liking.
The engineers doubled their rituals. They anointed every machine spirit with sacred oils, lit censers that filled the corridors with acrid incense meant to purify. Yet even the incense began to smell wrong, sweet, cloying, as if it too had been touched by unseen hands. Their hymns cracked, their voices faltered. A junior acolyte swore that, as he sang, another voice joined his own, low and chuckling, until he dropped his censer and fled, leaving the smoke to coil back into his lungs. By the second week, the manufactorum no longer echoed with the rhythm of work, but with the rhythm of coughing. Hammers struck slower, pistons misfired. The overseer's vox grills crackled with commands, but no authority remained in their tone. Even they were sick, their words interrupted by spasms of phlegm. Quotas still hung like banners of iron above the work lines, but no one believed in them. The Imperium's orders had grown distant, hollow like a memory of a voice long gone. Yet there were those who found something more than despair in the rot. A man named Rylus, once a riveter like Karos, began to speak in quiet tones of gifts rather than curses. He said his pain had faded, that the boils on his skin no longer burned but comforted him. He said he had been visited in dreams by a great garden beyond comprehension, where no one need labor, where every wound became a bloom and every cough a song. Some spat at his feet, others listened. A few began to believe. When one of the overseers dragged him before the garrison commander, demanding punishment for sedition, they found the man smiling. Even his chains bit into his wrists. They whipped him, but each lash opened flesh that healed not with scar, but with new, pus-filled growths that pulsed like living fruit. He did not cry out, he only laughed, and the laughter spread through the chamber until hardened soldiers clenched their teeth in fear. The commander ordered him shot. The last gun discharge cracked, clean and sharp, and his body fell twitching to the grating. But the laughter did not stop. It echoed still, long after the corpse was dragged away. Some swore they saw his lips still moving, still smiling, as the corpse was carted into the waste pits. After that night, faith itself began to fracture. Half the men clung tighter to their Aquilus, pressing them into their chests until the edges drew blood. The other half began to wonder if perhaps Rylus had glimpsed something the Imperium would not admit. Between those two halves lay only silence, broken by coughing, broken by laughter. And in that silence, the spores thickened. You could taste them now, bitter on the tongue, coating the teeth. The air no longer belonged to men. It belonged to something else, something patient, something waiting. The barracks stank of sweat, oil, and sickness. Every cot bore someone groaning in half-sleep, their skin flushed with fevers, or mottled by sores that refused to close. Medicae attendants worked without pause, applying salves, burning incense, and whispering prayers to the emperor that tasted hollow even as they spoke them. They had seen plagues before, common, ugly things that tore through regiments and then burned itself out, leaving the survivors hardened. This was not like those. This did not burn itself away. It spread, and it lingered, and every remedy turned useless the moment it was applied. Among the guardsmen, morale frayed like rotting cloth. Soldiers accustomed to charging into orc firestorms now trembled at the sight of a man sneezing. Comrades who once trusted each other with their lives recoiled at the touch of a hand. Rumors circulated faster than any Medicae efforts. Some said the plague had been brought in by traitors, that cultists within the manufactorum had prayed too long in the wrong tongue. Others whispered that it was punishment, the emperor's wrath for sins unspoken.
but most whispered the name no one wanted to admit aloud. Nurgle.
It was in the quiet hours of the watch that the true fear came. When the corridors dimmed, when only the sputtering lumens glowed against metal walls, shapes seemed to stir in the dark. Guardsmen swore they saw movement where none should be, lumps shifting in corners, shadows rippling with a pulse. One soldier fired his lasgun into an empty hallway after insisting he saw a bloated figure lumbering toward him. His squad found only dripping stains on the grating, slick and green. And when they touched it, the fluid hissed, eating through gloves like acid. The soldier was court-martialed, stripped of rank, but no one truly condemned him. They understood. They had seen things too. The manufactorum workers grew thinner by the day, though not from lack of food. Their bellies swelled grotesquely, even as their ribs jutted out, their bodies caught in some cruel contradiction. Some tried to flee into the wastes beyond the walls, but none returned. Patrols found only husks along the perimeter, bodies so distorted by bloat and rot they seemed more plant than man. Others chose a quieter escape, slitting their wrists in shadowed alcoves, whispering final prayers that bled into silence. Yet even those bodies did not decay as they should. They swelled, they split, and from the ruptures came crawling things too pale to be maggots, too deliberate in their movements to be mindless. The priests came then, marching with banners of the Aquila and incense thuribles heavy in their hands. They bellowed sermons that echoed in the cavernous halls, demanding penance, demanding loyalty, demanding faith unbroken. For a time, some clung to the sound of their voices. But sermons do not cleanse the lungs. Parchment prayers do not halt fever. One by one, the priests fell silent, their own bodies betraying them mid-verse. When one priest collapsed upon the pulpit, his belly split wide before his congregation, spilling a tide of writhing worms across the altar. The last of the faithful scattered. It was then the laughter began in earnest. Not the laughter of joy or sanity, but something gurgling, something that rose from bellies swelled with sickness. At first it came from a few, the ones who had spoken of gardens, of gifts. But soon it spread, until the barracks echoed not with coughs or prayers, but with a chorus of grotesque mirth. Those who resisted clamped their hands to their ears, but the sound lived beneath the skin. It infected thought. It turned dreams rancid. Men woke screaming, claiming they had heard the emperor himself weeping, not in sorrow, but in humor. The engine seers, desperate, sealed entire sections of the manufactorum. Great blast doors groaned shut, locking away whole divisions of workers deemed unsalvageable. But steel was never enough to hold back rot. Hours after the seals closed, green ooze seeped through the seams, bubbling as though alive. Those trapped inside pounded the doors until their fists broke. The pounding stopped too quickly. By now the air itself shimmered with sickness. Breathing was a surrender. Tasting it was inevitable. The spores no longer hid. They glowed faintly in shafts of light, glittering like dust motes caught in a sunbeam, beautiful in their deception. To stare at them too long was to feel the pull, to believe for just a moment that they were not the herald of death but of renewal, that to breathe them in was to step into something eternal. Some guardsmen gave in willingly, removing their rebreathers, opening their mouths wide as if receiving communion. And when they laughed, others began to wonder if perhaps it was not fear that had bound them all this time, but denial.
The commanders of the Astra Militarum finally convened in their command post, a sanctum of reinforced walls and flickering lumen strips, to discuss the situation. They had sealed the doors, posted guards at every entrance, and scrubbed the floors until the stone was raw. Yet even here, corruption had seeped in. The data slates carried by officers flickered with static. Vox lines croaked with half-words, laughter interwoven with orders that no one had spoken. The regimental banner hanging above them sagged, its edges spotted with mold despite the dryness of the air. They argued for hours. One called for quarantine, another for immediate extermination by fire. One spoke of summoning reinforcements, though none could be spared from the wider war. All the while their voices cracked with coughs they tried to disguise. None dared admit it, but every one of them felt the sickness creeping through his veins. The corruption had already seeded itself among them. Outside their sealed chambers, order collapsed. Soldiers once loyal to their commanders now drifted into splintered groups. Some followed the priests who still clung to broken faith, chanting litanies through bleeding throats. Others followed men like Rylus, who promised not damnation, but deliverance. "Why resist?" he whispered from shadows and corners, his eyes gleaming with fevered light. "Why fight the gift that frees us from toil? Why deny the garden waiting for us?" And his words were not dismissed. They were listened to. They were believed. A skirmish erupted one night between the two camps, faithful against the newly converted. The clash of lasguns in the Manufactorum's steel belly was a sound unlike any battle on the front. Here it echoed too long, swallowed by walls slick with sweat and slime. When the smoke cleared, corpses littered the grating, but none remained still for long. Flesh burst, bones cracked, and from their remains crawled things that should not live. Swollen mockeries of men, their bellies dragging along the floor, their mouths stretched wide in eternal laughter. Those still alive screamed, but screaming changed nothing. The dead had joined the chorus. The engine seers, in desperation, attempted one last purge. They flooded entire chambers with promethium, turning furnaces upon their own. Fire roared through tunnels, cleansing metal, scouring flesh. For a moment they believed they had succeeded. The flames consumed everything, leaving only ash. But in the silence after, when the last sparks faded, the ash shifted. From beneath it rose shapes blackened and blistered, yet alive, their bodies swollen with bubbling boils that burst open to spill more of the contagion. The fire had not purified, it had fed. And so despair became complete. The Manufactorum, once a fortress of labor for the Imperium's endless wars, now stood as a cradle for something far older, far crueler. Those who had resisted began to falter, not because their faith wavered, but because their bodies no longer obeyed them. Muscles knotted with rot, joints refused to bend, eyes clouded with pus. They knelt not in worship, but in collapse. In the end, only silence marked the turning point. No engines roared, no overseers barked orders, no soldiers drilled. Only the wet sound of breathing, too loud, too close, echoing everywhere. It was then they understood the Manufactorum was no longer theirs. It belonged to something else. And in that silence, the laughter returned. Not from one man or another, not from any mouth they could see, but from the walls themselves, from the air, from the very stone of the Manufactorum. A joy bubbling, mocking, eternal. The first spores had done their work. The infection was no longer hidden, no longer creeping. It had claimed its ground. And as the last unbroken soldiers gripped their weapons with trembling hands, they realized the true horror. The battle had not yet begun.
The morning they tried to reorder the world, the sky above the Manufactorum showed no sign it cared. Soot smeared the dawn into a gray bruise, and the banners that once snapped stiff with pride now hung heavy with damp, their imperial oculas mottled by a slow bloom of corrosion. The command post doors opened on a corridor that smelled of oil turned sweet and wrong, and from within came officers with hollow eyes, uniforms immaculate, voices fraying. They formed us on the drill square by rote, boots lined heel to heel along grating that flexed with a soft, wet give, as if the metal were becoming flesh and had not yet decided how to bear our weight. Sergeant Cassian Vale of the 119th took his place 2 ranks ahead of me, a narrow man whose spine had been straightened by a lifetime of salutes and funerals. He was the kind of sergeant the Imperium breeds in war and starves in peace, a man who could make a squad hold the line on a melting hull. His left hand never stopped rubbing the edge of his ocula pendant against his thumb,
and when he glanced down at it, some reflex of discipline dragged his eyes away again before he could see what the rot was making of it. Vale did not look back at us. He looked only forward, toward the dais where the colonel stood, flanked by priests whose thuribles coughed out incense that curled in the chill air and then clung to our lips like syrup. The colonel's voice came first through the vox grill, and then, a heartbeat later, from his mouth, the two sounds slightly out of time, as if the manufactorum itself were mocking him with an echo. He spoke of quarantine and of glory. He spoke of sacred duty to Terra and of the Emperor's light, of the need to reassert order, to reignite the rhythm of labor, to extirpate whatever heresy had taken root on these floors. His data slate flickered as he raised it, characters crawling like pale larvae before settling into the litany he meant to read. We recited the responses we had learned as children with rifles, the ones that make the body stiffen and the hand stop shaking. The flesh is weak, the spirit unbroken. The flesh is weak, the faith unending. When the priests lifted their staves, a wind moved. No true wind, not in those sealed halls, but a hush that felt like breath across the back of the neck. The smoke turned greener at the edges of the plume. I tasted it on my tongue, copper and sugar and damp earth, the promise of a garden under a grave. From somewhere beyond the square came laughter, the soft bubbling laugh of men who had forgotten fear because it had been replaced by something simpler. We did not turn. Vale would have broken our fingers if we had. The orders began, and with them the unraveling. Section seals to be reinforced, furnaces purged and reignited, work lines 6 and 9 brought back online by nightfall, patrols to scrub the perimeter for dissidents and for those who had begun to call themselves touched, any gatherings for illegal worship to be broken apart, lethal sanction authorized. Each command fell through the vox with a churr of static and an undertone like a wet chuckle. We accepted them as we were taught to accept the will of the Imperium, with the smallness of men facing a sky that would never know their names. The Scutari arrived at midday, a cohort that had been quartered in a sealed annex, all augmetics and ritual scars and the brutal calm of machine disciples. Their steps rang perfect on the grating, a metronome of obedience. Their visors glowed with measured light as they took position at the square's edge, and for a moment even the laughter in the distance stuttered and fell quiet. The engine seers with them sang Ben Herrick under their breath, voices braided with vox tones, and daubed the cohort's armor with sacred oils that had, in other times, smelled of bitter resin. Now the unguents were sweet, almost floral, cloying in the throat. The senior Scutarius lifted his galvanic rifle in salute to the colonel, an iron etiquette as old as the first forge, and his servos whined like a sigh. We moved to our assignments. Vale drew perimeter duty along the southern gantries that overlooked the waste pits where Rylus had been cast. I was on his heel with 5 others, our breath loud in the confines of our rebreathers, our boots finding purchase on rails slick with a sheen that stretched into threads when we lifted our feet. Beneath us the pit seethed softly, ash mounded like dunes, and here and there the ash moved with a will of its own as something beneath turned over in its sleep.
At Gantry South 3, a line of workers had gathered before a shrine niche set into the wall. Once that niche had held an icon of the Aquila. Now the stone was bare and speckled with a pale moss that formed a crude, laughing face. The workers were unarmed, sleeves rolled above wrists marked by sores. A woman at their front pressed her palms together and whispered that they wished passage to the lower tunnels. Vale barked that there were no tunnels for them, only work and quarantines. She did not argue. She only looked past him, as if listening to a voice none of us could hear, and smiled as one might at a memory of a childhood field. Behind her, a child of perhaps 12 winters coughed a cough that sounded like a giggle, and then wiped his mouth on his sleeve, leaving a smear of green that smoked in the cold air. The vox on Vale's shoulder spat orders: detain, disperse. If they refuse, make an example. What came with the orders was not a voice we recognized, not the colonel and not the priest.
something lower, wetter, as though the machine spirit were speaking through borrowed lungs. Vale's jaw moved once and then set. He raised his hand. We leveled our rifles. A Skitarii fire team pivoted into support at our flank, optics brightening as target runes danced across their displays. For a heartbeat, the world seemed almost stable in the shape the Imperium demanded of it: command, compliance, consequence. Then, the senior Skitarius twitched, as though a gnat had landed beneath his eye lens. Another twitch took his shoulder. His rifle dipped. The engine seer beside him reached to bless the weapon, found his finger sticking to the ceramite as if honey had been poured over it, and jerked back with a hiss. Where the engine seer's augmentic palm touched armor, a patina bloomed, verdigris under lacquer, the color of old coins left in rain. The Skitarius turned his visor toward the engine seer, and from within his vox grill came a sound that was not a word and not a scream, but a laugh wrapped in a sob. Across the square, somewhere behind us, klaxons woke and then drowned themselves in static. The smoke from the priest's thuribles thickened, green at the edges, and rolled low along the ground like fog seeking a throat. Vale's Aquila pendant slipped in his grip. A smear of gray-green followed his thumb, and when he looked down this time, discipline could not save him from what he saw. The workers did not flee. They waited, eyes bright with fevers, hands open as if for a blessing. Vale's raised hand trembled. The vox purred in his ear: detain, disperse, make an example. His hand fell halfway, indecisive, and that was the moment everything learned to choose for us. Vale's hand hung in the air uncertain, as if the muscles had forgotten whether they belonged to him or to some other will. The child in the workers' group coughed again, that same bubbling laugh, and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. What glistened there was no longer blood. It shimmered with a sickly iridescence, a color not meant for human sight. And yet it was undeniable, alive in its own repulsive beauty. The Skitarii at our flank should have acted in that moment, should have raised their rifles and fired a volley to scatter the workers. But they stood motionless, as if their machine spirits had been lulled to sleep. One of them tilted his head slightly, servos whirring, and for a heartbeat I saw something impossible. His visor flickered with an image of leaves swaying, of vines crawling across iron, of flowers opening in grotesque slow motion. When his optics cleared, he did not raise his weapon. He lowered it, the galvanic coils crackling once, then fading to silence.
Vale snapped. He drove the butt of his rifle into the worker woman's chest, sending her sprawling across the grating. Her followers surged forward, not with fists, not with weapons, but with open hands, as if reaching for an embrace. The squad opened fire, the sound of lasbolts filling the gantry with stuttering light. Bodies fell, burned holes punched clean through fevered torsos. Yet still, some of them laughed as they died, green vapor spilling from their mouths, curling upward as if carried on a breeze that did not exist. I felt it then, not in my lungs, but deeper, as though a weight pressed against the marrow of my bones. For a single breath, I wanted to laugh too. The urge clawed at the back of my throat, bitter and sweet all at once, a promise of release. I bit down on it so hard, I tasted blood. The engine seer who had recoiled from the Skitarius stepped forward now, muttering a binary hymn so fast it broke into static. He drove a mechadendrite into the nearest worker corpse, attempting to sample the corruption for study, perhaps even to appease the omnisia with knowledge. What came back through his interface was no data stream. His eyes went wide, and the mechadendrite convulsed like a living thing, snapping itself free in a spray of green filth. The engine seer fell to his knees, screaming words in no language I knew, then began to claw at his own throat as if he were trying to vomit something out that was not there. Vale shouted orders, but his voice cracked mid-syllable. The Vox answered him, not with command, but with laughter, the same bubbling tone we had all begun to hear in our dreams. For the first time, I saw fear break him. His rifle dipped, his shoulders sagged. He looked at us, his squad, his brothers, and I swear I saw the question in his eyes: fight or surrender? We dragged the survivors back from the gantry. The Skitarii did not follow. They remained there, motionless, their optics dimmed as though watching something we could not see. As we retreated, I glanced back once more. The bodies of the slain workers were shifting, their limbs twitching in rhythm, spasms almost choreographed. From their wounds, small blooms were beginning to sprout, mosses, tiny flowers with faces like open mouths. The air shimmered around them. By the time we reached the barracks, order was already gone. Squads ignored the chain of command, ignoring Vox orders that no longer made sense. Some guardsmen tore off their aquillas and hurled them into the waste pits, shouting that faith had abandoned them. Others knelt in prayer until their knees bled, begging the emperor to return his gaze. Between the two, silence stretched like a no-man's land. And in that silence, the corruption grew bold. Spores glowed openly in the air, luminous as stars in a void. I watched Vale sit on his cot, hands shaking, staring up the aquila in his palm. For hours he rubbed at it as though he could polish the corruption away. But when he finally lifted his gaze to me, the aquila was gone, dissolved into a gray-green smear across his skin. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Duty was unraveling, and in its place, something else was being born.
Sergeant Vale no longer stood with shoulders square and chin high. He hunched forward on his cot, his ocula dissolved into stain, his hands trembling as though each joint was rotting from within. We looked to him still, because habit is stronger than hope. But what looked back at us was not the same man who once dragged us through firefights on worlds whose names we never learned. His eyes were rimmed in red, and every so often his lips curled, as if resisting a smile that did not belong to him. The garrison's command post had grown quieter by the hour. Officers who sealed themselves inside never emerged again. The Vox repeated their voices long after they had ceased, distorted, stretched as though someone else wore their tones like stolen skins. "Hold the line," the Vox croaked in the colonel's timbre, but the cadence was wrong, too wet, too amused. Some men believed it still. Others smashed their Vox units and swore never to listen again. One night, a patrol returned from the northern tunnels with only 2 survivors out of 12. They staggered into the barracks wide-eyed, their uniforms slick with green ichor that steamed in the cold. When questioned, they spoke over each other in fevered fragments, of a machine shrine overtaken by blossoms, of a tech priest whose augmetic limbs had fused with vines, of hymns sung backward until words lost meaning. One of the survivors laughed mid-sentence, his ribs shuddering, then choked and collapsed. From his mouth spilled a slurry of moss and worms. The other survivor shot himself before anyone could stop him. By then, faith had become a weapon wielded as desperately as lasguns. Some clung harder to the emperor's name, carving oculas into their flesh, muttering prayers even as rot bloomed around their wounds. Others began to gather in secret, whispering to the Plague Father, offering their sores and coughs as proof of devotion, and the line between soldier and worker blurred. Men of the Astra Militarum sat shoulder to shoulder with riveters and laborers, their laughter mingling, their prayers to Nurgle rising soft and steady like the hum of a machine spirit resigned to new masters. Those of us who resisted began to see duty as a chain of rust, each link breaking faster than we could mend it. Guard life depends on rhythm, but there was no rhythm now. Rations spoiled before they were eaten, water reeked of mildew, boots fused with slime that refused to scrape away. The manufactorum itself seemed to declare that duty was no longer possible, and when a soldier cannot serve, what remains of him? Vale still tried. He ordered us into firing lines, made us march in place, recite the catechisms of loyalty. Our boots splashed in filth, our voices cracked with fever. Some obeyed. Others laughed openly in his face. One spat blood at his boots and said he'd rather be free in the garden than chained to a corpse of an empire. Vale shot him on the spot. The man fell, his laughter echoing even after death, and every one of us felt something inside us loosen. We were no longer soldiers. We were fragments, drifting between obedience and surrender, between the ocula and the garden. The manufactorum had stolen duty itself, and without duty, we no longer knew who we were. And in that confusion, the corruption deepened its roots. Vale's execution of the defiant soldier should have reignited fear, should have tightened discipline, but instead it exposed the hollowness of the chain of command. The last burn still smoked in the air when the men beside me shifted uneasily, not in respect, but in resentment. One spat on the floor. Another muttered that Nurgle's garden promised mercy where the Emperor only offered pain. The whispers grew louder than the prayers, and no bolt pistol or whip could silence them now.
The priests tried one last sermon in the square, standing before a congregation of hollow-eyed workers and soldiers. They lifted their censers high, smoke pouring like rivers, chanting the litany of the unbroken will, but their voices faltered. One priest's tongue swelled mid-verse, splitting into pulps that dripped down his chin. Another's eyes clouded with pus, his hymns breaking into a gurgling laugh. The crowd murmured in awe instead of horror, some reaching out as if to touch the transformation, as if this grotesque unraveling were proof of divinity. By the time the priests collapsed, writhing in ecstasy or agony, no one stepped forward to carry their bodies away. The congregation simply parted, letting the fallen lie among the puddles of slime as though they had finally become part of the sermon itself. The Skitari, once the immovable pillars of discipline, stood apart in eerie silence. Their optics flickered like dying lumens, their movements jerky, uncertain, as though their machine spirits had been infected with doubt. One by one they broke from formation. A lone Scitarius wandered into the manufactorum pits without orders, his rifle dragging behind him until the shadows swallowed him whole. Another removed his helmet, revealing a face more metal than flesh, and pressed his augmetic lips to a wall slick with mold, as if drinking from it. None returned to their posts. None obeyed their engine seer's cries. Inside the barracks, despair grew tangible. Soldiers tore insignias from their armor, not in rebellion, but because the symbols had begun to corrode and rot, staining their chests with green-black streaks. A few clung desperately to their aquilas, carving them deeper into skin, their blood mixing with pus, as if the very symbols bled against them. But most no longer saw the aquila at all. They looked to the laughing workers, to the whispers of gardens that haunted every dream, and their eyes shine not with defiance, but with longing. Vale tried to hold us together, his voice cracked with fever, his body shivering in armor that no longer fit right on his frame, but he still barked orders, still forced us to patrol corridors slick with slime, still slapped rifles back into trembling hands, and we followed, not out of duty, but because habit can outlast faith. Yet even he could not silence the laughter that echoed through the halls. At night, when we lay in the barracks, I heard him muttering in his sleep, words not of the catechism, but of something softer, wetter, a prayer that was not meant for the Emperor. It was then I understood the truth. Duty is not broken in a single moment. It rots slowly, like flesh left too long in damp air. We had not abandoned the Imperium in revolt. We had been worn down, unstitched, thread by thread, until the banners above us meant nothing,
and the hymns we once sang tasted bitter on our tongues. By the time the command post fell silent completely, its doors never opening again, no one cared. No one asked what orders the colonel might have left. No one believed there were orders at all. We were no longer soldiers of the Astra Militarum. We were husks in uniforms waiting for something to claim us. And something was waiting. For in the depths of the Manufactorum, where the shadows dripped and the walls breathed, laughter grew louder. Not a single laugh, not even a chorus, but an ocean of mirth, swelling, rising, promising that duty had withered only to make space for something greater. The Aquila had broken. In its place, a new emblem was taking root, though none dared name it aloud. The Manufactorum had always been a monument to endurance. Its forges roared without pause, its servitors clanged without complaint, its conduits sang with the heat of Promethium and the pulse of iron discipline. But now every sound was wrong. The machines no longer roared, they coughed. Gears ground against themselves as though their teeth had softened, pistons shrieked like wounded animals, and the once constant rhythm of industry broke into gasps and stutters.
Along the southern line, conveyor belts sagged under the weight of their own corruption. What should have been oiled steel links were now coated with a glistening film that pulsed in time with no visible heart. When a servitor tried to place a riveted sheet upon it, the belt surface rippled, swallowing the sheet whole. Sparks showered from above, and the servitor froze mid-motion, Vox grill stuttering prayers in binary until the growth consumed its legs. Within moments, man and machine alike were gone, absorbed into the writhing surface, leaving only a slick residue that smelled of rot and roses. The engine seers fell into hysteria. They howled binary canticles, striking their sensors against the steel as though violence could restore purity. But their voices cracked into static, their hymns answered by a deeper resonance from the walls themselves. The Omnissiah's song had been replaced by another, wet, low, and patient. Some tech priests tore out their own augmetics in horror, their once sacred limbs twitching like worms on the floor before melting into pools of greenish slime. Others knelt in rapture, their optics bright with fever, whispering that the machine god had revealed a new aspect of itself, a garden engine, fertile and eternal. The Astra Militarum squads tried to reclaim control with fire. Promethium tanks were hauled into position, their nozzles aimed at the spreading growths. With a roar, blue flame swept across the Manufactorium floors, devouring moss, vines, and filth alike. For a moment, hope flared. The air filled with the familiar tang of burning fuel, and we cheered as the corruption blackened and curled away. But Promethium is a weapon of war, not of gods. When the flames died, the ash they left behind stirred. From beneath it sprouted shoots of vibrant green, faster and thicker than before, flowers blooming in seconds where fire had passed only minutes earlier. And this time, the blossoms exhaled spores in clouds so thick that respirators clogged, lenses misted, and soldiers fell gasping to the floor, their last breaths stolen by sweetness too cloying to resist. Steel walls groaned under new weight. Pipes that once sang with the steady rush of fuel bulged outward, their surfaces blistered like diseased flesh. Some burst, spraying not oil but a viscous, reeking ooze that hissed when it touched skin. Floors cracked open to reveal cavities filled not with stone or machinery, but with tangled roots and swollen pods that pulsed as though something gestated within. We fought to keep our boots above the filth, but the grating sagged beneath us, and men fell through into darkness that swallowed their screams too quickly. In the command post, what officers remained tried to keep their voices steady over the vox. They ordered barricades built from broken machinery, demanded firing lines across collapsing gantries, insisted that duty remained unchanged. But their voices reached us with undertones, soft chuckles, wet sighs, and we no longer believed the words belonged to men. Some obeyed anyway, too terrified to do otherwise. Others smashed their vox units and prayed only to die before they laughed. I remember one night when the ceiling cracked open above line 12. It should have rained dust and stone, but instead it dripped black ichor, thick and slow. The droplets sizzled against the metal floor, each one leaving a crater that smoked with a green haze. A squad was posted beneath that breach. By dawn, their armor was found abandoned, piled neatly, their rifles stacked as if in offering. Of the soldiers themselves no trace remained, but a scattering of footprints pressed into the slime, footprints that grew smaller with each step, until they ended in nothing at all. The manufactorium had begun to consume itself, and us along with it. Flesh rotted, steel rusted, order dissolved. What remained was a carcass of a world, animated not by duty, not by fire, but by a patient, inevitable mirth. And still in the shadows, the laughter grew louder.
By the third week, the manufactory sounds formed a language no human tongue should speak. Conveyors clicked like teeth in a laughing skull. Cranes groaned as if straining at leashes. Even the lumen strips flickered in a rhythm that felt deliberate, a pulse we tried not to match with our breathing. The engine sears chalked wards in machine oil and ash, lines of sigil script along bulkheads and shrine doors, but the marks ran like tears, smudged by condensation that smelled of damp soil after rain. They told us to keep moving, to deny the growth any stillness in which to root. We moved. The roots followed. We took to clearing teams, 5 and 6 at a time, pacing the catwalks above line 9 with flamers and axes. The first obstacle was a collapsed crane, its cable spool fused into a tumor the size of a hab unit. Nerves of vine and copper coiled together until you could not tell which had started as plant and which as wire. A servitor hung half-swallowed from the mass, skull plate tilted, vox brill emitting a soft nursery hum in Benheric over and over, the lullaby of a machine spirit going to sleep. Vale ordered it put down. The shot punched through its forehead. The lullaby continued for a full minute before descending into a wet gurgle. We cut for hours, sweat slicked beneath our armor, respirators hot, skin prickling with fever that never broke. Every time the flamer passed, the growth recoiled, then rallied, creeping back to kiss the cooling metal with a lover's patience. Between bursts, I heard it tune, carrying up from the lower floors, too steady to be incidental. Dozens of voices humming in a single note that broadened in the chest and set the teeth on edge. The hymn, if that is what it was, smelled like sweetness when you breathed it, like overripe fruit. Some of the men swayed before catching themselves on railings. We reached the old foundry mouth just as the gantry shuddered under our boots. Below, the casting vats heaved, their surfaces skinning over with a thin, translucent film that dimpled where bubbles rose and popped. Steam left the vats in coils that gathered themselves into the suggestion of faces, slack and smiling, then broke apart when you stared too long. Vale knelt and ran a gloved finger along a seam in the grating. The glove came away slick and threaded with something fibrous that twined back toward the metal, resisting separation like a sinew reluctant to leave bone. He cursed, not in the catechism, but in the language of gutters and trenches and old wars, then signaled us onward. At the junction to the machine shrine, a Skitarii lay propped against the wall, visor dark, helm dented inward as if by a hand too soft to bruise steel. His cortex plug pulsed once,
twice, then stilled. Beside him, a ribbon of prayer parchment had been tacked to the bulkhead. Its ink had bled until the words were no longer Benheric, no longer low Gothic, but a series of curves that looked, at a glance, like vines climbing a trellis. One of our troopers, Ket, reached to tug the parchment free. The moment his fingers touched it, the ink ran up his hand. He screamed and flung himself backward, the characters crawling like black beetles beneath his skin. Vale pinned his arm and scored the flesh with the combat blade until the lines bled out. The bleeding did not stop. Ket's hand shook for the rest of the day, curling into a cradle, grasping at nothing with the tenderness of a man soothing a child he could not see. The machine shrine doors stood ajar, their pistons clogged with a pale putty that had once been grease. Inside, incense burners lay overturned, sacred oils congealed into iridescent puddles. A tech priest's robes trailed into a thicket of cable vines, the figure beyond absorbed to the waist. Mechanodendrites lifted as if in perpetual benediction. From the vox altar came a voice we recognized, Megos Deltus, intoning a maintenance prayer we had heard 1,000 times during inspection. The words were correct, but the cadence smiled. Vale advanced to silence the vox. When he touched the control stud, the prayer shifted key. For an instant, no longer than a heartbeat, the voice spoke my name. Then it spoke Vale's. Then it laughed with the Megos' breath. We fell back with our flamers, trying to cauterize the altar into muteness. The flames fountained, blue-white, and the vox grill sagged. A smell like caramelized fat wrapped the shrine and clung. When the flames died, the grill reformed itself in blisters, pocked and pitted, and the prayer resumed where it had paused. A phonograph needle set back into a groove that would not wear out. Vale looked ready to shoot the wall. Instead, he aimed upward and torched the smoke where it hung thickest. The smoke writhed. For the first time, I felt it push back.
On our way out, we passed a line of cogitators that had once tabulated quotas and output. The lumen runes on their screens had crowded together into rough daisies, petals of numerals circling a dot. Ket swore he could hear the machines giggle. I told him it was coolant cycling. He asked me why coolant sounded amused. I did not answer. That night, the barracks roof sweated. Drops formed at the rivet heads and fell on faces and blankets, cool at first, then warm as if heated by skin. Men woke to find their bedrolls sprouting a nap of fuzz that rasped against the cheeks like a lover's whisper. Someone tore down the picked slate of an imperial martyr and threw it into the corridor. In the morning, the slate was back on the wall, the martyr's eyes sunken, the mouth curved in a beatific grin that had never been engraved there. Vale gathered us at dawn and spoke quietly, as if loudness might draw more attention than we could afford. We would fall back to the upper galleries, seal the access bridges, ration our promethium for the last purge. He wanted a line that meant something, even if it meant it only for an hour. We nodded, as men nod to a friend who knows the wound is mortal but binds it anyway. We moved at first light, or what passed for light in a sky that had not shown its true color in weeks. The bridge to the galleries arced above the central chasm, a spine of iron stitched over darkness. Halfway across, the iron moved. It did not warp with heat or bend with weight. It flexed like a back being stretched after sleep. We froze, bolts sheared with little metallic sighs. From beneath the rails, filaments uncurled, pale as tendons, lacing our boot soles. Vale gave the word to burn. The flamer coughed. The pilot guttered. Something in the dark below laughed. A deep, soft, patient sound, not cruel and not kind. The laugh of a thing that had never known haste. The bridge flexed again. The bridge flexed once more, and the sound that escaped the metal was not the shriek of stressed steel, but the groan of something alive, stretching in languid delight. Our boots slipped against rails slick with sweat and slime, rifles clattering as men struggled for balance. Vale's voice cut through the panic, hoarse and cracking. "Burn it!" But the flamer coughed again, a hollow rasp, its pilot light smothered as if the very air had turned against it. Then the laughter rose. It came from below, from the chasm that the bridge spanned, and it rose not in a single voice, but in multitudes, bubbling, joyous, as though the abyss had become an amphitheater filled with unseen revelers. The spores shimmered in the air, glittering like a galaxy in miniature, and as they touched our armor, they clung, glowing faintly green. Some men swiped at them frantically, others froze, transfixed, watching as the motes drifted lazily toward their faces, as if the corruption wanted to be inhaled. Vale ripped the flamer from Ket's hands, snarling a prayer to the Emperor that sounded more like a curse, and slammed the pilot igniter against the grating. Sparks leapt, caught, and fire blossomed, washing the bridge in a searing blue light. For a moment the spores recoiled, the laughter faltered, the filaments lacing our boots blackened, curling away with a hiss. Men cheered raggedly, desperate to believe the Prometheum still had power.
But the fire died too quickly, smothered not by lack of fuel, but by moisture seeping from the bridge itself. Drops of fluid fell upward from beneath, defying gravity, sizzling against the flame until nothing remained but smoke. In the smoke, faces formed, smiling, swollen, whispering words none of us could understand, yet somehow all of us felt in our bones. Ket screamed, dropping his lasgun, and stumbled backward into Vale's arms. For an instant, he looked like a child clinging to a father. Then his body convulsed, mouth opening wide, and a spray of green mist burst from his lungs into Vale's face. The squad broke. Some bolted for the far end of the bridge, their boots slipping on rails that pulsed like veins beneath them. Others fired wildly into the chasm below, their las bolts disappearing into the darkness with no effect. The spores thickened, turning the air milky, clinging to visors, slipping into rebreather seams. I felt the burn in my chest, the temptation to inhale deeply, to surrender to the sweetness on my tongue. My hands shook so violently, I nearly dropped my rifle. Vale staggered, coughing, his face hidden behind his mask, but his movements frantic. He slammed the butt of the flamer against the bridge, sparks leaping again and again, but the igniter refused to catch. The bridge swelled beneath us, filaments rising, curling around ankles like affectionate serpents. One trooper tripped, dragged, screaming toward a fissure opening in the iron. His body folded unnaturally as he was drawn through, bones snapping, laughter spilling from his throat as he vanished into the dark. I ran then. I don't remember choosing to. My body simply moved, instinct tearing me forward. Behind me, Vale shouted orders drowned in static. Ahead, the gantry loomed, its doors half shut, vines twined across their edges like fingers trying to pry them closed. I threw myself through the gap, slamming into the deck beyond. Others followed, gasping, coughing, eyes wide with terror. Vale was not among them. Through the narrowing gap I saw him one last time, standing on the bridge with the flamer raised high. The spores swirled around him, motes of green light wrapping him in a halo. He struck the igniter again. This time it caught, fire blooming around him in a radiant storm. His laughter mingled with the chorus from the abyss, not broken but full, as though he had found at last a truth none of us could deny. Then the doors slammed shut, cutting the bridge from sight. Silence followed, but it was not peace. The metal beneath our hands pulsed faintly, like the heartbeat of something vast and patient. And in that silence, every man who had survived knew the truth. Flesh had begun to fall. Steel had begun to fall. The bridge was not lost, it had been claimed. And the manufactorum was still hungry. We sealed the doors with chains and prayer. Chains snapped easy these days, but prayer snapped easier. Still, the motions gave us something to cling to. We braced metal scraps against the threshold, welded plates until sparks stung our faces, and listened to the muffled laughter beyond, as though the bridge itself mocked our effort. The sound was distant now, yet it never truly left. It vibrated through the walls, trembled beneath the floor, lodged in the marrow of our bones.
The upper galleries had once been safe. They overlooked the manufactorum floor like balconies above a theater of industry, filled with command terminals, cogitators, and pict feeds. Now the screen showed nothing of use. Static rippled across them in waves of green and black, sometimes resolving into shapes, a smile here, a blossom there, before dissolving back into chaos. The cogitators clicked endlessly, printing reams of parchment covered not in numbers or quotas, but in looping patterns that resembled vines, circles within circles, spirals with no center. One soldier burned a stack, only to find the smoke smelled sweet, and the ashes left behind continued to curl and rearrange themselves long after the fire had died. We posted watches, though no one trusted their eyes anymore. The spores drifted here as well, faint but constant, glowing whenever the lumen strips flickered. In the half-light, men began to mistake one another for things they feared or dreamed of. Ket was gone, Vale was gone, but still some swore they saw them pacing the catwalks at night, rifles in hand, their faces sagging with rot, yet smiling as though they had never known despair. Others claimed they heard the voices of wives, children, commanders long dead, calling softly from the darkness, urging them to come home. Food spoiled in sealed containers, water turned to slime overnight, ammunition corroded in its cases, las charges fizzling useless when tested. We scavenged what we could, but every day the manufactorum found new ways to remind us we were intruders in what had become its domain. And yet worse than hunger, worse than thirst, was the laughter. It never stopped. Sometimes faint, sometimes deafening, it curled into every silence. It was no longer cruel, it was patient, almost affectionate, as though inviting us to share in the joke. On the fourth night in the galleries, the walls shifted. Not visibly, not all at once, but we felt it like a muscle flexing in slow, deliberate rhythm. Plates groaned, rivets wept slime, and the floor bowed beneath our boots. Men gripped rifles tighter, but the rifles had become meaningless in our hands. When the floor split open near the cogitator bank, none of us fired. We only stared as roots pushed through, thick as cables, dripping with moisture that smelled of wet leaves. The roots did not lash out, they simply grew, coiling across the gallery, wrapping around consoles, crushing them in gentle embraces. One soldier stepped forward as though hypnotized, reaching to touch the nearest vine. He whispered something, maybe a prayer, maybe a plea, and when his hand brushed the surface, the vine opened like lips. He was gone before anyone could pull him back, swallowed whole, leaving only his rifle clattering to the floor. That was the moment duty collapsed entirely. Some fell to their knees, surrendering. Others bolted into the corridors, desperate for escape, though none returned. The few of us who remained simply stood there, rifles slack at our sides, knowing that no barricade, no torch, no command could turn this tide. Flesh had fallen, steel had followed, and now even faith itself bent beneath the weight of inevitability. I remember standing by the pict feeds as the vines coiled tighter around them. For a heartbeat, the static cleared, and the image that flickered into view was not the manufactorum floor, but something else entirely. A garden, infinite and lush, its blossoms grotesque yet radiant, its air thick with joy. Figures moved within it, shapes bloated and radiant, their laughter rolling like thunder across fertile soil. For an instant, I wanted nothing more than to step into that image,
to leave behind rust and duty and become part of something eternal. Then the screen went black. The vines squeezed. The cogitators died. The manufactorum no longer needed steel. It no longer needed us. It had begun to dream of gardens.
The silence after collapse was worse than the collapse itself. When machines scream and steel bends, a man knows what threatens him. When nothing moves, when no gear turns, when every lumen strip flickers low but does not die, the danger seeps inward. We breathed it with every shallow gasp, tasted it in the air, a sweetness that lingered too long. It was not death, it was invitation. In the upper galleries, we learned to fear sleep. Dreams became too vivid, too lush. Some nights I wandered endless fields of green, stalks higher than manufactorum chimneys, blossoms opening to reveal faces I knew, soldiers, workers, even Vale, smiling as if every burden had lifted. They spoke without mouths, voices carried on the wind, telling me to rest, to lay down my rifle, to sink into the soil soft as silk. I would wake with tears drying on my cheeks, aching with a longing I could not name. Others confessed the same. We began to avoid closing our eyes, but fatigue was relentless. No man can fight forever. One by one, men broke. Garin, who once carried the regimental banner into battle without trembling, began speaking softly to someone none of us could see. He claimed a figure stood beside him, a gardener draped in robes of moss, who taught him hymns sweeter than any catechism. He hummed them day and night, the notes crawling into our ears until we heard them even in silence. When we begged him to stop, he only smiled and told us the emperor had never intended us for war, that true peace waited only a breath away. Vale would have shot him once. Now there was no Vale, only the echo of his laughter from the bridge. We let Garin sing until he vanished in his sleep, leaving only a damp outline on the cot where he had lain. Whispers grew bolder. They drifted through the air like spores, curling at the edges of thought. Sometimes they sounded like officers giving orders, but softer, patient, coaxing rather than commanding. Other times they were voices of family long dead, promising reunion if we would only breathe deeper. The manufactorum itself had become a choir, and we were its congregation whether we wished it or not. The priests who survived the collapse tried to answer with sermons, but their faith was thin now, their eyes shadowed by fever. They raised Aquilas blackened by rot, shouted that dreams were lies, that whispers were heresy. But even their words faltered, choked by coughs that rattled with green mist. One priest broke mid-sermon, laughter bubbling from his lips until he fell to his knees, clutching his Aquila so hard it fused to his palm. He begged forgiveness, even as his chest split open, vines sprouting from his ribs in a grotesque parody of resurrection. Those who watched either wept or fell to their knees beside him, not in horror, but in awe. The engine-seers fared no better. Their binary chants now carried harmonies they did not intend, as if another voice sang through them. Some claimed they glimpsed a vast garden machine, roots of brass and blossoms of copper, where the Omnisia's will and Nurgle's gift were one. They drew schematics of flowers that were also engines, vines that powered cities with their growth. I found one such drawing scrawled in blood and oil across a wall, its lines trembling with desperation. The engine-seer who had drawn it was nowhere to be found, though mechadendrite tracks trailed off into the dark. Still, not all surrendered willingly. A handful of us clung to the tatters of duty, rifles slung across shoulders, fingers raw from clutching Aquilas, even as they corroded. We tried to mark time with watches, to keep faith with the rhythms of soldiering. But time no longer obeyed. Hours stretched and bent. Days ended too soon or not at all.
Sometimes we saw dawn through cracks in the manufactorum ceiling, pale light falling upon rust. Other times night never lifted, and the spores glowed brighter in the dark. And always the whispers grew clearer.
They no longer sounded like dreams. They sounded like truth. On the fifth night without proper rest, I woke to find Lauren kneeling in the corner, his rifle set aside, his helmet cast off. He cradled a lump of moss in both hands, as though it were an infant, rocking it slowly, whispering lullabies in low Gothic. The spores around him pulsed with his words, rising and falling in a rhythm like breathing. I tried to rouse him, but his eyes had changed, soft, glassy, filled with adoration. When I touched his shoulder, he turned to me with a smile too wide for his face and asked if I wanted to hold the child. The moss shifted as if alive, a small green tongue unfurling toward me. I fled before I could answer. The whispers twisted deeper into our thoughts, slipping between prayers and memories until we could not tell them apart. Some said they heard the Emperor's voice, gentle and warm for the first time, telling them that he had always been the gardener, that Terra itself had once been a seed planted in his name. Others swore they heard Nurgle directly, his laugh swelling like a storm, promising that there was no such thing as decay, only renewal. The arguments became heated, fists raised, faith turned to confusion. Yet the whispers never contradicted. They agreed with both, feeding each belief until men no longer knew whether they worshipped the Emperor or the Plague Father, or if the two were one and the same. At the edge of the galleries, a pict slate began to glow, though its power had long since died. It showed images of fields we had never seen, flowers taller than hab blocks, rivers thick with honeyed water, skies of perpetual dusk filled with drifting spores like constellations. Men gathered around it, entranced, as if it were a relic of the Imperium. One even knelt and prayed, claiming it was a vision sent from Terra itself. But when the image flickered, I saw shapes moving among the blossoms, figures swollen and radiant, their bellies distended, their flesh sagging, their mouths open in endless laughter. No one else recoiled. They called it paradise. One soldier, Ren, tried to resist. He tore the pict slate from the wall and smashed it against the deck, shouting that it was lies, that only the Emperor's light could guide us. For a moment, I believed him, but the whispers did not fade. They grew louder, angrier, like bees stirred from a hive. The spores thickened around him, swirling in a storm until he vanished from sight. When the haze cleared, there was nothing left but his boots, standing upright, laces still tied, filled not with feet, but with soil sprouting delicate shoots. We began to fear resistance more than surrender. At least surrender was gentle, filled with warmth and laughter. Resistance was answered swiftly, erased as if it had never been. The manufactorium was no longer a place of work or war. It was becoming something new, something fertile. Its corridors curved like roots, its walls breathed like lungs, its floors pulsed like veins. We walked not on iron, but on the skin of a world remade. I tried to pray then, quietly, clutching my aquila so tight the edges cut into my palm. But the blood that dripped from my hand did not fall. It soaked instantly into the floor, vanishing like water into dry soil. From the spot where it vanished, a tiny sprout pushed upward, green and glistening, its leaves shaped like hands reaching toward my own. I dropped the aquila. The whispers chuckled softly, like a father amused by a child's reluctance. And for the first time, I felt not fear, but shame. Shame that I had resisted for so long. Shame that I had not already accepted the garden that had been waiting all along.
On what might have been the 7th day, or the 30th, time had unraveled so thoroughly that counting felt like superstition. We heard bells. Not the clangor of shift change or the crisp peal of parade, but a slow, liquid chiming that seemed to drip from the ceiling and pool in our ears. Men rose from their cots without orders, drawn down a corridor whose walls had softened from riveted plates into scallop ridges patterned like leaf veins. The air was cool there, sweet as bruised fruit. Spores fell in a fine snow that did not melt against our armor. It nestled, clung, and pulsed faintly with our heartbeats. At the corridor's end, a door we did not remember had grown where no door should be. It was not forged. It had budded, a round of lacquered, living lacquer that shone as if varnished by breath. Lauren stood before it, bareheaded, cheeks hollowed by fever, pupils wide with the wonder of a pilgrim. He lifted a hand as if to knock, but instead laid his palm flat against the surface. The door sighed. A seam opened, pedal slow, and warm drafts washed over us, dense with scents that should not coexist. Roses blooming in gutters, rain in a charnel pit, the innocence of a nursery folded into the musk of a midden. Beyond, the manufactorum was gone. No cranes, no furnaces, no rattling belts. A hall stretched away like a nave, lit by a dusk that had no source. Vines braided into arches, heavy with nodding blossoms whose faces were almost faces, smiling in sleep. Pods glowed along the floor like lanterns sunk in loam, translucent enough to show dark shapes curled inside. Somewhere out of sight, water chuckled, and the chuckle was laughter blurred into gentleness. Men crossed the threshold. Some fell to their knees, weeping, overcome by a peace so sudden it scalded. Others stood transfixed, heads tilted as if listening to a sermon too lovely to endure. I held back one step, then another, the part of me that still wore an aquila, if only as scar, struggling against the pull that felt like gravity turned personal. The whispers thickened into words, not in my ears, but behind my eyes, gentle and conversational. They offered no threats. They offered rest. They spoke of a burden I had never named but had carried all my life, the weight of being a man in a machine designed to grind men down. Lay it here, they said. Lay it down and be remade in laughter. Lay it down where suffering is fertilizer and failure is simply seed. Someone brushed my arm. Garen. No, the outline of Garen, damp as if stepped from rain, stood beside me, his regimental banner gone, his hands empty and soft. He did not glow. He did not preach. He simply looked unburdened, and that was the most terrible miracle of all. "It isn't death," he whispered. "They lied about that. It's a garden." A tremor rippled through the hall, a pleased parental shiver as if the place approved of the phrasing. Lauren moved first. He approached a low pod that hummed like a contented throat. The membrane thinned as he neared, and something within pressed back, a child's foot against a mother's belly. He laughed. Oh, Emperor, he laughed like a man who had forgotten war, and laid both hands upon the skin. The pod opened. What rose was not a monster, not a soldier, not a man. It was possibility given body, a figure swollen and radiant with no wound left unblossomed. It took Lauren's face in both drooling hands and breathed into his mouth. Lauren sagged, then straightened, and when he turned towards us, his eyes were bright with a joy that hurt to look at. "Come," he said, not pleading, not commanding. I was wrong to fear. The priests who remained with us tried to answer, but their voices were crumbs in water. One lifted his aquila and shouted a litany of warding, and the blossoms bent toward him like congregants, attending with exquisite courtesy. The priest stepped backward until his shoulders met a vine column that curved to support him, cradling him as a mother does a fevered child. He sank to his knees and sobbed, the aquila marking his palm in a greenish bruise where metal should have bit.
I took a step across the threshold. The floor yielded slightly under my boot, resilient as turf after rain. Tiny spores popped under my heel with the softest of sighs, like the last exhalation of a sleeping infant. The air felt heavier, but not oppressive, weighty the way a hand is when it settles on your shoulder in forgiveness. I tried to recall the catechisms, the names of heroes whose statues line parade grounds on worlds far from here. Their faces blurred. Vale's laugh echoed from the bridge like a distant bell. I could not recall the tune of our regimental hymn. I could recall the smell of the hall perfectly. Along the wall to my left, a mural had bloomed. Not pigment, growth. It portrayed gardens layered upon gardens, orchards that bore books instead of fruit, hedges trained into the shapes of saints whose mouths opened to pour honey, fields sown with weapon parts that sprouted into flowers whose petals were shields. In one corner, a throne gleamed beneath a sun whose light was a choir. The throne was empty. Around it, lines of tiny figures knelt, their heads bowed, their bodies open with blossoms where wounds had been. Above the empty seat, threads of gold and green braided together into a star that pulsed with the rhythm of a heart I almost recognized. A rumor breathed itself through me. Astronomicon, not as beacon, but as pollen. I did not speak it. I did not believe it. I only understood how such rumors could be adored. Wren's boots waited near the mural, their laces still tied, shoots tickling the tongues. I stared at them until the hall's laughter softened to a hush, as if it too wished to see whether I would step out of mine. Somewhere deeper within, a bell chimed again, a sound like marrow thawing. Lauren reached for me, fingers outspread, eyes bright with forgiveness I had not asked for. "Lay it down," he said, and the hall echoed him, 1,000 throats not quite in unison. "Lay it down and grow." I lifted my hands. I did not know whether to surrender or to pray. The difference had thinned to a membrane I could pierce with a breath. From behind us, faint as a memory, a vox sputtered to life. The voice was raw, human, undecorated by chuckle or chime. "If you can hear," it said, "there's a way up." The whisper hall stilled, listening, almost amused. "Signal tower. Old sky gantry. Not taken. Follow the red—" Static ate the rest. A petal fell somewhere like a tear. Lauren's smile did not falter. "Old voices," he murmured. "They haven't learned the joke." My feet were already moving. Toward the call or toward the garden, I could not say. The door pedal shivered behind me, eager to close. The vox sputtered again that night. Static hissed, then broke into fragments of language that cut through the sweetness of the spores like steel scraping bone. "Sky gantry. Still clear. If you can—" The voice fractured into noise, then into laughter not its own. Some clutched their helmets tighter, desperate to cling to the human cadence hidden within the static. Others turned away, whispering that it was a trap, that the garden was trying to trick us with false hope. Yet I knew what I had heard, a voice that trembled not with amusement, but with fear. Fear felt real.
Lauren begged us not to follow. He said the gantry led nowhere but back into war, back into emptiness, back into the Emperor's silence. He told us that the garden was a gift, and that rejecting it was like spitting in the face of a father offering his child shelter from the storm. His words were gentle, persuasive, dripping with something more dangerous than anger, compassion. And men listened. Some even embraced him, pressing their foreheads against his, tears streaking their faces as if in reunion. He promised them joy everlasting, bodies free of pain, voices lifted in eternal laughter. But I could not forget Vale's last stand on the bridge. He had burned himself into ash to resist what called from the abyss. It was madness, yes, but it was also choice. In this place where choice eroded into whispers, that act had burned brighter in my memory than any hymn. So I gathered what few remained unswayed, less than a squad, shadows of soldiers once proud.
We clutched our lasguns like relics, though the charges were failing. The spores clung to our visors, glowing faintly as though mocking our resolve. We spoke no prayers, for our prayers no longer held weight. We spoke only names. Names of the fallen, names of cities we once defended, names of brothers who had never laughed. The names steadied us more than any litany. The way to the gantry was a descent into unreality. Corridors had twisted into tunnels shaped like arteries, their walls slick with sap that beat faintly like a pulse. Each step left our boots damp. Blossoms opened as we passed, releasing sighs that formed half words, urging us to stop, to rest, to smile. One man faltered, reaching out to brush a petal, and it wrapped around his wrist lovingly. We pulled him free, though he left behind his skin, peeled away like a glove. He did not scream. He only stared at his exposed tendons, smiling faintly as though the pain had been erased. We dragged him onward anyway, because to stop was to surrender. The whispers grew louder as we neared the tower. They no longer pretended to be dreams or memories. They were direct, insistent. They told us the gantry was empty, that the voice on the Vox had already been taken, that even if we reached it, the sky itself was gone, choked by spores, sealed beneath a canopy of rot. They told us that resistance would not save us, only prolong our suffering. One man dropped to his knees, clutching his head, screaming for silence. His scream cracked into laughter before we silenced him ourselves. The shot echoed down the artery, swallowed quickly by the walls. At last the tunnel opened, and there it was, the gantry, rising into the dark like a ladder built of rust and defiance. Red paint marked its rungs, smeared by hands that had climbed before us, hands that had left trails like blood. Above, a faint glimmer of lumen light pulsed. Whether real or illusion, I could not tell, but it was not laughter, and that was enough. Behind us, the door petal of the garden shivered, widening as though to swallow us back. From within, Lauren's voice called, soft, pleading, "You don't have to suffer. You don't have to die alone." I placed my hand on the gantry rung. It was cold. It was iron. It was real. And for the first time in weeks, I almost believed in escape. The climb began in silence. Our boots grated on the iron rungs, hands slick with sweat, breath rasping behind failing respirators. Below us, the manufactorum pulsed and sighed, its laughter echoing faintly through arteries of steel and root. Above, the sky gantry rose into shadow, each rung marked with a smear of red, as though painted by desperate pilgrims. The spores followed us, glowing faintly, drifting upward like embers from a funeral pyre. Every step felt heavier, not from fatigue alone, but from the whispers tugging at our heels. They grew sharper now, more urgent, no longer patient. They called us traitors to joy, deserters of the garden. They promised that the climb was pointless, that the sky was no longer sky but canopy, that even if we reached the top, we would find only rot. One voice sounded like veil, laughter strained into command. "Come back! Don't leave me burning alone!" Another voice sounded like my mother's, long dead on a world I barely remembered, promising that she had already bloomed, that she was waiting in a field where pain could never follow. One man faltered. His hands slipped from the rung as he looked down into the abyss, eyes wide, lips trembling. He whispered something, perhaps an apology, and then he let go. We did not see him fall. The spores caught him, bore him away into the dark, and his laughter rose like smoke, mingling with the manufactorum's chorus until it was impossible to tell his voice from the rest. We climbed faster. The air thinned as we ascended, no longer thick with the sweetness of rot, but sharp, acrid, metallic. It burned the lungs in a way that felt clean after so much cloying perfume. Our visors misted with condensation, our hands bled from torn gloves, yet the ache was almost welcome. Pain was proof that we were still flesh, still separate from the garden.
At last we reached the gantry platform. It jutted into a cavernous expanse, open to what had once been the manufactorum roof. Great sheets of steel had peeled away, torn back like the petals of a flower, revealing a sky that was no longer void-black, but veined with green light. Spores drifted thick as stars, swirling in patterns that threatened to form constellations. And there, in the center of the gantry, stood the signal tower. It leaned, rusted, its vox array cracked and bent, but it lived. Faint lumen strips flickered along its spine, and the dish above pulsed with a heartbeat glow. The sight stole our breath. It was not the Emperor's light, not the Astronomicon's holy beacon, but it was human. It was machinery still resisting, still transmitting, still carrying a voice that trembled with fear rather than faith. And fear, in that moment, felt holier than faith. We staggered toward it, but the whispers rose like a storm. They crashed against our skulls, shrieking that we had betrayed the embrace, that we had spat upon the gift. The spores thickened until the air turned milky, until we could see only the vague outline of the tower ahead. Shapes moved within the fog, familiar shapes, Vale with his flamer, Garen with his banner, Lauren with his radiant eyes. They reached for us, their hands dripping spores, their voices soft and pleading. One by one, men faltered, breaking ranks, stepping into the fog to embrace the phantoms. They did not scream, they did not struggle, they simply vanished into the whiteness, their rifles clattering to the deck. Each time the whispers grew louder, bolder, more certain of their victory. But I kept climbing the gantry steps, one after another, hand over hand, teeth clenched against the sweetness in the air. The tower's vox grill crackled faintly, promising that if I could only reach it, someone, anyone, might still be listening. And in that hope, fragile and flickering, I placed my faith.
The tower's ladder was narrow, the rungs worn smooth by hands far steadier than ours. I climbed first, because hesitation spreads like mold, and I could not bear to watch it bloom again. The dish loomed above me like a cracked moon, its surface pitted, its feed horn wrapped in tape long gone gray. A windsock tugged itself weakly on a bent spar, though no wind moved, only the slow tide of spores, drifting in eddies that sometimes formed circles and then unspooled as if embarrassed to be seen. At the service platform I found the panel ajar, its latches furred with corrosion that brushed off like ash. Inside, cabling slept in loops. A handprint in dried oil marked the excess plate, smaller than mine, the outline delicate. Someone else had come here recently, or time had finally learned to mimic hope. I thumbed the breaker. A spark snapped my finger, a sting so honest I nearly laughed. Lumen strips along the mast brightened from bruise to pallor. The vox array coughed as if clearing its throat. "Signal tower," I said, voice rasping, more prayer than report. "If there's a world left to hear." Behind me the squad spilled across the gantry like shadows learning to stand. Two men sank to their knees, not in worship, but because the climb had stolen everything but breath. One reached for the railing and drew back with a hiss. The paint was tacky, as if the metal beneath had begun to sweat sap. From below, the manufactorum laughed, distant, indulgent. The spores thickened, creeping into the tower's dish in a ring that looked too much like a wreath. I adjusted the gain, the band, the ancient dials, whose numbers had long since faded. The speaker crackled, chewed static, then bit down on a sliver of sound, a woman's voice, thin as wire. "Say again, repeat, sky gantry, if you can reach." The words blurred, returned. "Quarantine grid failed. Custodes, rumor only. Do not rely. Repeat, do not rely." The channel shattered, reformed. Astra Militarum units ordered to withdraw to orbital. No orbital. Imperial preserve us. Then only snow. A man beside me began to weep, ugly and quiet, head bowed.
He had fought orcs in the dust of a nameless moon and not cried when his brother died with a chopper in his ribs. Now he cried because a voice had said, "Do not rely," and the truth of those words was heavier than any order. I keyed the mic. My name caught. I could recite serial codes, regiment number, world of mustering, but my name felt fragile as a scab. This is a survivor at Manufactorum Theta 7. Multiple heretic vectors. Biological, no, spiritual, no, both. If you can hear, there are still men here. If you can't send fire, send a prayer that hasn't learned to laugh. I let go the key and realized I was shaking. The tower hummed under my palms like a living throat. The spores answered with a flurry, an eager snow. They gathered around the dish's lip, knit themselves together in filigree. Through them faces tried to form, Laron's smile, Vale's grin at the moment the flamer bloomed, Garen's serenity. Each one incomplete, as if the spores had learned our dead the way a child learns letters. "Lay it down," they whispered, but the tower's speaker hissed over them, spiteful, human. "Theta 7, copy!" A new voice, closer, rough as a scraped knee. "We read you. Skypath unreliable. Astronomic and occlusion localized. Repeat, localized. If you can ascend to roofline, red flare will mark pick." The words drowned in a wet chuckle that wasn't his. "Hold on! Hold! Hold on!" The signal guttered, flared. I slammed the gain. The dish squealed, a noise like metal torn by hopeful hands.
The laughter below surged, patient no longer. It came up the gantry in waves, sweeping over the rails, fluttering the ragged windsock. In its wake the spores thickened into curtains, veils of soft light through which shapes drifted, plump silhouettes, arms out in welcome, bellies radiant as if carrying harvests. Men at the gantry edge stiffened, transfixed. One stepped forward and the veil wrapped him, tender as bedding. His rifle clanged once. He sighed. The veil swallowed the sound. I shouted orders without realizing they were mine. "Fix masks, fix lines, keep eyes on the dish. If you fall loud." A pair of troopers lashed cables from the mast to the railing, bootlocks clacking. Another man cranked the emergency transmitter until sweat dripped from his chin. The wheel turned, stubborn but obedient, and with every rotation, the beacon's lumen brightened by a fraction, a heartbeat fighting for rhythm. "Do you hear me?" I breathed into the mic. "We are at the tower. We can mark an LZ. We can—" The gantry shook. Not the flecks of rot enjoying itself. A shudder, sharp, external. Somewhere above, something punched through the spore canopy and sent a ripple of green across the sky like wind through wheat. The men looked up and forgot to be afraid. We watched the canopy knit itself after the intrusion, offended, quick to heal. But for an instant, there had been a wound in the garden. "Flare!" The voice snarled, fighting laughter in the line, as if wrestling a beast. "Now!" One trooper fumbled a red stick from his pouch, hands clumsy, teeth bared like an animal chewing through a snare. He struck it against the mast. Nothing. Again! A spark sulked and died. The third strike took, spitting a gout of crimson that hissed in the wet air. The flare spat light and smoke like anger on a holy day. Spores were coiled, their veil punched full of holes. Beneath us, the Manufactorum answered with a roar that was not a roar. The corridors below exhaled, sending gusts of sweet air up the gantry in a tantrum of perfume. The veil surged back, furious and hurt, trying to smother the flare with kisses. We ringed it with our bodies, hoods down, cloaks up, as if our thin flesh could stand against a world's desire. The tower's dish whined. The beacon stuttered, then steadied. 1 beat, 2, 3, red light clawing at the canopy's belly. In the speaker, the voice howled a wordless triumph that cracked into a sob. Over us, the sky shivered, green bruised to black for the space of a heartbeat. "Hold," I said, and did not know to whom. My hands were raw on the railing, skin lifted in flaps where rust had taken payment. The flare shortened, sputtering, color draining, smoke thinning. When it died, it would be only us again, and the patient mirth would return, as inevitable as tide. The spores gathered for their answer, thick as cloth, ready to drop. Somewhere below, a door sighed open, and Lauren's voice floated up, soft as a lullaby. Lay it down. Grow. Above, something cut the air with a sound like a knife dragged across a hymn. The sound tore the veil of spores as if it were cloth. Not laughter, not whispers, but a roar like atmosphere set aflame, a shriek of engines forcing their way through a sky that had forgotten the concept of resistance. The canopy above, green-veined and luminous, blistered under the assault. It split into ragged apertures, streaks of black night clawing through, lit by flashes of red. For the first time in what felt like centuries, the stars winked down on us. Not constant, not safe, but real.
The men who remained with me lifted their faces as though an old prayer had been answered. Some began to laugh, not with the garden's chuckle, but with a sound born of disbelief and exhaustion. Even my own chest heaved with something perilously close to joy, though it was tempered by fear. For the spores reacted instantly. They thickened into tendrils, coiling up the gantry, wrapping the rails in velvet that pulsed like veins beneath skin. From below, the manufactorum bellowed. The halls shuddered as if the entire structure were drawing breath to reclaim us. And then he appeared. Lauren, or what had become of him. His body was swollen, skin stretched taut with glowing fluid, blossoms pushing through the seams of his armor. His eyes were lanterns now, radiant with mockery and compassion. He did not climb the gantry. The vines bore him aloft, delivering him to our level like an offering. "You could have laughed forever," he said, his voice no longer his own. It resonated with countless undertones, each syllable soaked in amusement and pity. "Lay it down. Even now the Father's garden is open." One of my troopers raised his lasgun and fired. The beam tore through Lauren's torso, spilling a shower of spores that glittered like diamonds. He did not falter. He only spread his arms wider, as though inviting us to waste our ammunition. The vines swelled, rushing toward the tower. But then a second sound split the air, the thunder of cannons, the screaming descent of ordnance. Shells detonated across the canopy, ripping vast wounds through the spore sky. The manufactorum reeled, its laughter breaking into screams that were almost human. A gunship tore through the breach, its silhouette angular, brutal, unmistakable. Searchlights stabbed downward, cutting through the fog with surgical precision. Vox commands barked, sharp and unyielding. The Astra Militarum had not abandoned us after all. Or perhaps it was only one vessel, acting on rumor, on desperation. It did not matter. It was enough. "Mark the flare!" I shouted. And though the first had guttered out, one man struck another. This time it caught in an instant, a furious red that smeared the gantry in color. The light was reflected in Lauren's radiant eyes, and for the first time he frowned, the spores recoiling from its defiance. The gunship banked, hovering above, side doors yawning open. Heavy bolters spat fire into the vines, clawing toward us, tearing them apart in showers of sap and pollen. A cable hissed downward, swinging wild in the smoke. I seized it. The others clamored for it too, hands slipping on slick gloves, voices breaking into curses and prayers. Behind us, Lauren's laughter had returned, louder now, though edged with something frantic. He reached, blossoms bursting from his fingers, vines writhing to ensnare us. For a moment I thought we would all be dragged back into the embrace, smothered in love until no voice remained. But the gunship surged higher, wrenching us into the air. The gantry buckled beneath, swallowed by the manufactorum's convulsions. Lauren's voice faded into a chorus, then into static, then into silence. The spores surged upward, furious, desperate, but the gunship's engines burned them to ash.
The canopy closed behind us, sealing once more, but we were already rising into the wounded sky. For the first time since the garden had bloomed, I could breathe air that was only air. Thin, cold, and harsh. It cut my lungs like glass, and I welcomed the pain.
The cable bit into my harness, jolting my ribs, but I did not loosen my grip. The ascent was savage, the wind clawing at my visor, the gunship straining against the drag of a world that did not want to release us. Below, the manufactorum convulsed, its chimneys bent inward like stalks in a storm, its furnaces vomiting not smoke, but clouds of spores that rose in towers, clawing at the sky. They tried to follow us, to weave themselves into nets that could drag us back down. But the engines burned hotter, spitting flame and promethium, carving a wound through the garden's embrace. Men dangled on the line beside me, their faces streaked with grime, their eyes wide with disbelief. One sobbed without sound, his breath stolen by the gale. Another clung so tight his knuckles tore through his gloves, flesh exposed to the cold. We were no longer soldiers, not really, just remnants, pulled upward by steel and willpower. For every man that clung, another had fallen, swallowed by the spores without scream or echo. I tried to count who remained, but numbers had lost their meaning. Survival was not mathematics. It was accident. The gunship tilted, and we swung hard against its belly. Hands reached down, gloved, firm, human. They hauled us inside, one by one, tossing us onto the deck like cargo too fragile to weigh. My knees struck steel, honest steel, and the sound was more beautiful than any hymn. For a moment, I simply lay there, my chest heaving, the world spinning, while the engines howled us free of the manufactorum's grasp. The interior was cramped, stinking of promethium, machine oil, and men. But it was real. Every surface was scarred, every rivet rattled with the vibration of the engines. A commissar barked orders, his greatcoat billowing in the draft. His eyes were hard, but behind the hardness I glimpsed relief, proof that even iron discipline could bend before miracle. Medicae rushed among us, jabbing stims, sealing wounds, whispering reassurances we barely heard. I crawled to the hatch, dragging myself upright against its frame, and looked back. The manufactorum receded beneath us, its bulk sagging inward like a carcass left too long in the sun. Vines writhed across its surface, reaching skyward, weaving themselves into towers of rot that toppled under their own weight. Blossoms opened wide as mouths, releasing clouds of spores that shimmered like auroras. From their midst, I thought I saw Lauren again, or something that wore his shape, standing atop the broken gantry with arms outstretched. He did not curse us. He did not rage. He only smiled, radiant with pity, as though we had broken his heart by leaving. Then the clouds folded over him, and he was gone. The commissar slammed the hatch closed, cutting off the sight, cutting off the garden's voice. Darkness swallowed us, punctuated only by the red lumen strips along the walls. For the first time in what felt like eternity, there was silence. Not the silence of spores holding breath, not the silence of laughter waiting to resume, but true silence. The silence of men too exhausted to speak. I realized then that I was trembling, not from fear, not from cold, but from the sheer absence of the whispers. Their departure left a wound. My skull rang with the echo of voices that no longer pressed against me. Without them, I felt hollow, as if something essential had been torn out. I wanted to laugh, to cry, to scream, but nothing came. Only shaking, only breath. The commissar leaned close, his vox grill inches from my face. "You will give report," he said, not unkindly. "You will tell us what bloomed down there." I nodded, though words would not come. What could I tell him? That suffering had worn the mask of mercy? that joy had been offered like a noose padded with velvet, that we had been loved utterly and without condition, and that love had nearly erased us? The gunship banked hard, engines straining toward the void above. Through the slitted viewport, the stars brightened, sharp as needles. They looked indifferent, eternal. Yet to me, they were salvation.
I pressed my forehead against the cold glass and whispered a name, Vale, or Garin, or perhaps my own, I could not tell. The stars did not answer, but at least they did not laugh. The ascent to orbit was a blur of vibration and silence, punctuated by the cough of engines and the occasional barked command from the crew. No one among us spoke. Words felt dangerous, as if opening our mouths would let the garden creep back in, disguised as our own voices. I sat with my back against the bulkhead, rifle across my knees, though it was long since drained. My fingers twitched on the trigger anyway, muscle memory refusing to yield even to futility. Through the viewport slits, the stars widened into clarity. The void welcomed us, black and vast, uncaring but clean. For the first time since the bloom began, the air was not perfumed with sweetness. It was sharp, filtered, dry. Each breath scoured my throat, reminding me that I was still alive, still flesh. That truth should have comforted me, but instead it weighed heavy. Survival, stripped of meaning, can be more terrible than death. A Medicae moved among us, touching shoulders, checking pulses, whispering reassurances like prayer. His hands were steady, but his eyes betrayed him. He saw what clung to us, even if the spores had burned away. He saw how laughter had hollowed us, how joy had been carved into our marrow. He stitched wounds and sealed fractures, but he could not heal what had been planted. When the commissar returned, he did not ask again for report. He simply stood, gauntleted hands clasped behind his back, and regarded us as one might regard a ruin salvaged from fire. His vox grill clicked before he spoke. "You will be quarantined, your words recorded. The garden will not spread through your tongues." His tone was iron, but I heard the unease beneath it. He feared us, not for what we had done, but for what had touched us. Perhaps he was right to fear. The gunship docked with an orbital barge, a vessel scarred from war on a dozen worlds. Its crew wore masks thicker than any we had seen, their eyes hidden behind black lenses. They did not greet us as brothers in arms. They herded us down corridors lined with incense braziers, the smoke acrid enough to sting. Every corner of the barge smelled of cauterization, as if it had been scrubbed again and again against contamination. We were placed in a chamber lined with hexagrammic wards, the symbols etched deep into the steel. The door sealed with a hiss, and we were alone. Some men collapsed, asleep before they hit the floor. Others sat rigid, eyes wide, as if afraid sleep would deliver them back into blossoms. I leaned against the wall, listening to the hum of the barge's engines, and thought of Lauren's smile. Was it pity or triumph? Was it his or the garden's? I could not say. I only knew that I would see it forever, waiting at the edge of every dream. A vox chime sounded within the chamber. The commissar's voice came through, distorted by layers of filtration. "You will be processed upon arrival to Terra's authority. What you saw will be studied and judged. Until then, you will remain silent." His words should have steadied me. They should have anchored me to the Imperium, to the Emperor's will. Instead, they hollowed me further, for silence was what the garden had asked of us too. Silence, surrender, and growth. Perhaps the only difference was the mask it wore.
I closed my eyes and breathed. And for the first time since the rescue, I felt it again. Faint, patient, waiting. Not laughter, not yet. Just the memory of sweetness lingering on the back of my tongue, like fruit bruised but still edible. I shuddered and forced my mind elsewhere, to Vale's flame, to Garen's banner, to the names we had spoken when prayers failed. They anchored me better than iron.
though they too were slipping into shadow. The stars beyond the viewport did not laugh, did not weep. They burned, indifferent, eternal. And perhaps that was the final embrace. Not the garden's love, not the emperor's light, but the void's unyielding silence. We had escaped the garden, but it had planted something within us that no fire, no ward, no silence could uproot. I pressed my palms together, not in prayer but in habit, and whispered into the hollow air, "Emperor, if you still hear, let me die before I bloom." The engines thrummed, the chamber sealed tighter, and the laughter, faint as breath against glass, promised it had only just begun.